In this tutorial we're going to look at how we can use waste yarn to help us close the gap when we set a circularly knit sleeve into the body of a cardigan, for example. So here is our sleeve. We've got just a little tube, and we're going to imagine that the underarm position is just here, and these will be the last 4 stitches of the previous round, and then there are the first 4 stitches of the next round. Finish knitting your sleeve either before or after the stitches that are going to be joined, because you don't want to joggle right in the middle. Now what we'll do is take some waste yarn and knit a little flap of waste yarn onto the 8 stitches that are going to be left live. This orange yarn is my waste yarn. It should be the same weight as your working yarn, but brightly contrasting. So all I'm doing now is, instead of putting these 8 stitches onto a holder or onto a thread, I'm knitting a small flap in stocking stitch using the waste yarn. About 4 rows will be plenty. And I've made sure I've finished my knitting either just before or just after that point, it doesn't matter which. Now I'll just continue to knit a stocking stitch flap on those stitches. Here is my sleeve. Those are the stitches that are going to be joined at the underarm. And now we'll join this in with the rest of the knitting. I've worked to where I want to put my sleeve in, so the next 8 stitches here are going to be the ones I put aside for the underarm. So I'm going to do exactly the same as before, take another piece of the same colour of waste yarn and work another 8 stitch waste yarn flap just here. There's my working yarn. I've knit across, let's say, the right front of the cardigan. I've come to the right underarm, and now I'm going to take the right hand sleeve that's already been worked and amalgamate it. So this would be how you would do a seamless cardigan worked from the bottom upwards. But there are other circumstances where you have joins between 2 opposing directions of fabric. So I'm just working all the rest of my sleeve stitches. There's my sleeve, there's my underarm. I've knit around the rest of the sleeve, and now continuing with my working yarn, not the bit I've got left over from the sleeve, I'm going to carry on knitting across the row. And in this way you can knit the front, the back, the sleeves all at the same time, and in real life you would carry on until you'd put the second sleeve in on the other side. And now from here you would carry on making shapings on either side of the sleeve if it was going to be a raglan or whatever you're going to do, and you'd finish the cardigan. So the very last stage of finishing the cardigan is to join this underarm gap. I've now completed my micro raglan. There is the underarm position, there's my raglan on the other side, and I've finished my cardigan, but I just have this big gap at the underarm. So all we need to do now is tuck the 2 flaps inside the garment, and we're going to take a separate piece of yarn and graft these 2 rows of stitches together. This is an imperfect graft because the stitches are coming at each other head to head. So the sleeve was knit from this end up to here, the body was knit from this end up to here. So the best we're going to get is nearly aligned. There'll be half a column out of alignment. I've lined my 2 pieces up by eye, and now starting in the middle with a separate piece of yarn in a contrasting colour, I'm going to sew the stitches. What I did there was I simply copied the orange waste yarn stitch. So it's just like I'm duplicate stitching. And if I do the pinch test here, can you see the blue stitch is perfectly happy? If I went in a different position, if I went from here to here, can you see that's not what the orange yarn does? And then if I did the pinch test, it turns it into the dreaded 11s, and we don't want that. So you have to learn to follow the waste yarn, which will hold the 2 sides of this, which are actually 2 sides of separate blue stitches, but where they want to come together to be a V. And I do the pinch test. Normally you'd do this in the matching colour yarn, but it's easier when you're practicing and for demonstration to use a contrasting colour. So I'm going to come vertically down and back a little bit to the right and copy this orange stitch just here. It goes in here, round there. And again I should do a pinch test on this side, but I'm pulling in the opposite direction this time. I'm pulling up towards the sewing line, and the blue stitch is happy and the white one looks fine. From this point forward you always go back to where you came from, copy the next waste yarn stitch, which is why the bright colour contrast is important. Back to where you came from, copy the next waste yarn stitch, and once you've got it established you should find it fairly easy. Now the nice thing about this method is it doesn't matter if you're what you want to sew left to right or right to left, or if your stitches are mounted strangely on the needle compared to other people's. Works for everyone. Now we get to the end here and I can go back into that last blue stitch just one more time, and that's as far as I can go at that end. And if I look down here I have half a blue stitch left, so that's as good an alignment as we can hope for. So I'm going to turn it round and take the other half of the yarn, which I left for the purpose of sewing in the opposite direction, and do the same thing again. We've already got it started, so we go back to where we came from, around the base of what looks like a stitch. It's actually two different stitch sides. And we pull the white yarn or your sewing yarn to the same size and shape as all the rest of their friends in the knitting. Back to here, and I'm into my last stitch side up at the top. Now here I've got half a stitch left there, and once again that's as well aligned as I can be. So we'll now unpick the waste yarn from both sides, and this is how beautiful it should look from the public side. Now we have to deal with the holes at either corner. Join me for part 2.